Okay, I think we can get started. Thank you all for joining us for today's Lunchtime Art Talk on Larry Johnson. As many of you know, the Lunchtime Art Talks are a weekly series led by the Hammer curators on works from the museum's collection primarily. This season of the series has been focused on Made in LA 2020 Aversion artists. This is the last in the series. The exhibition is currently up at the Hammer Museum and at the Huntington, but we'll be closing on Sunday. So we encourage you to come see the show. And thank you for those of you who have been repeat visitors to these Lunchtime Art Talks. My name is Lauren Mackler. I'm one of the curators of the Made in LA. Alongside Miriam Ben Salah and Aike Onyewanyi. And today I have the great pleasure of facilitating a talk on Made in LA artist Larry Johnson. After the presentation, I'll answer some of your questions, but a few Zoom notes before we begin. When the presentation starts, please select speaker view at the top right corner of your screen, and in the top middle of your screen, please click view options to ensure side by side and fit to window, and that's going to be kind of optimal viewing. I should also mention that today's presentation is being recorded. So if you'd like to opt out of being recorded, you can turn off the camera icon on the bottom left corner of your screen. You all will remain on mute until the end. And then when it's time to ask questions, I will unmute those who have questions. But during the presentation, if you have any questions, you can pop them into the chat. Okay, that's all that information, and now I'm going to begin. So Harry, let's start with some slides. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little primer on Larry Johnson, and then I'm going to talk about the various works that are in the Made in LA Biennial. That's today's structure a little bit. Larry Johnson's work often comprises text and image, and mostly takes the shape of photographic works. That is, in this case, for example, an illustration photographed, printed, and then framed. Intentionally elliptical and famously elusive, Larry Johnson's works really evade interpretation, and probably because they have a lot of different meanings, sometimes depending on the person reading them and the moment in culture at which they are reading the image. Wayne Kostenbaum, the writer, in a recent talk, or in a 2015 talk about Larry's work, described it as holding a gay intertext in which we can break the code, but the information might still not be there. So I'll get more into this as I get into my presentation, but I suppose I wanted to start with a kind of disclaimer, perhaps more for me than for you, that talking about Larry's work today is really not about decoding it, and that's an impulse I have to resist. However, I have read a lot of writers about Larry, and I can share with you today some of the context that they've given to his work or provided for his work. That said, my favorite text is from 1996, so there may be some room for updating Larry's perspective, and I'll leave space for that too. So a lot of Larry's subjects circle around entertainment and sex. Their titles, or rather his untitled subtitles, often are points of entry or additional information into the works. So for example, this work, which is untitled Admit Nothing, which titles a work in which 50s movie ticket stubs read, "Admit my ass," is a great example of that kind of complementary read between title and image and the text within the image. One writer, for example, has interpreted this image as, situated within an era of conspiracy and paranoia, and can also be read a little bit also like a social climber hitting a wall. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide. Thank you. This work is titled Untitled, Standing Still and Walking in Los Angeles. And curator Russell Ferguson points to the work as an homage to poet and curator Frank O'Hara, because the title, Larry's title, is modeled on a line from O'Hara's poem Ode to Causality, in which O'Hara says, standing still and walking in New York. And Larry transposes that to Los Angeles. And again, Ferguson kind of interprets projecting it onto from the everyday into the everyday of a hustler culture, which to evade police attention has to be seeming to be walking while actually standing still and staying in one place to be able to host customers. Next slide, please. Okay, so those are just kind of two examples I wanted to begin with, but rewinding a little bit, Larry Johnson was born in 1959 in Lakewood, California, which is a town you have an image of here, which is a 1950s development, a really typical American town, modeling upward mobility and fostering a consumer class, and built all around a mall whose motto was "Tomorrow's City Today." So this question of time kind of jumps into Larry's sort of upbringing immediately. His mother was a beautician and his father drove trucks. And class politics in America end up featuring heavily in Larry's work as well as a kind of subtext, as does location and questions of entertainment, or rather what kind of entertainment each person can get based on their economic class. I'll also note that Lakewood was probably a pretty oppressive place to think about or to be brought up in terms of how masculinity is considered. It's famous for later, much after Larry's upbringing, but Joan Didion writing about the Spur Posse scandal, which happened at Lakewood in the early 90s, in which high school athletes had created a point system to compete over acts of sexual assault. After Lakewood, Larry did both undergraduate and graduate work at CalArts, and he started showing work with a recurring cohort of artists, both on the East Coast and on the West Coasts. Some names that you might recognize that were regular, other artists in the exhibitions that Larry was in include Liz Larner and David Cambrera. I should also say that Larry is and has been a teacher for many years, primarily at Otis, where he also co-taught with Bruce Hanley classes, including one on Elizabeth Taylor, another on Los Angeles, and one on musicals. There's a lot there. Next slide, please. So Larry has had many gallery exhibitions and a handful of substantial survey exhibitions, including one very comprehensive one at the Hammer, curated by Russell Ferguson in 2009, and another survey-esque exhibition at the amazing Raven Row space in London, titled On Location, curated by Bruce Hanley and Anthony Hudek in 2015. This image is the cover image of the catalog for that show. And earlier in his career, in 1996, he had a large show at the Belkin Art Gallery in Vancouver. So each one of those exhibitions came with a catalog and some pretty phenomenal essays about Larry's work. While working on Larry's work for this biennial, I read as much as I could and found that the cohort of writers who write about him actually make a really telling list, including Russell Ferguson, of course, from the Hammer, but also Dave Hickey, Bruce Hanley, Gary Indiana, and David Riminelli, all writers, kind of cultural critics, interested in the legibility and layered reads of popular culture. So there are more writers, and I'll mention them in a moment. Next slide, please. So Larry's pictures, or photographic works, as Bruce Hanley puts it, involve image and text pulled from a range of sources, but primarily a quotidian experience of culture. Double entendre, word play, and meaning play run amok in his images. I'm going to avoid the word appropriation because it arguably sets up a kind of us versus them between source material and output. But they are found. They're kind of ready-mades of text. So at first, his texts really were pulled from sources of the everyday, stuff within reach like news clips, obituaries, TV guide descriptions, biographies. And then in the early 1990s, he started writing his own text in various voices, almost like an actor taking on roles. In terms of how he makes them, so his images, he has used a lot of industry techniques like commercial illustration, animation, and graphic design. And I guess it's notable that before his digital era, or before he started using more digital materials, Johnson or Larry had a day job producing network graphics for television, so he had access and experience with all these tools. So up until the late 90s, he was rephotographing a lot of the images he made, so like paste-ups and illustrations. But starting in the early 2000s, he started scanning and using more contemporary tools of digital imaging. So the subjects that Larry deals with are, at least on the surface, often celebrity and death, sex and class divides. This is maybe the first work that really put Larry on the map, and it's titled Untitled Movie Stars on Clouds. And it's a work that can be kind of read as a heaven, an illustration of heaven, or the opening credits of a film. It has that kind of aesthetic of text versus image. This is just 2 images from the series. The full series has Clark Gable, Marilyn Monroe, Montgomery Clift, Natalie Wood, James Dean, and Sal Mineo. The first 3 that I named were starred in The Misfits, which is a 1961 film written by Arthur Miller. That's sometimes said to be a cursed film because these 3 actors went on after the film to have pretty unhappy lives and early deaths. So it kind of sets us off into thinking about both celebrity and death as subjects for Larry. And I think one of the reads of that is that they exist as a kind of public common ground. Both death and celebrity have this kind of overarching reach. In a 1990 interview of Larry for Flash Art, the writer David Riminelli asks Larry, "What about celebrity and stardom in your work?" And Larry replies, "Well, they're great motifs because you don't have to do any background for the reader." So this relationship actually to the reader starts very early on for Larry. Next slide. This work is from a series of winter landscapes, and it's titled Untitled Classically Tragic Story. Once Larry started writing his own texts and narratives, he took on a lot of different voices and a lot of different subjects, even stories that were kind of the pop cultural realm. This one in particular tells the stories of the stars, the actors and stars, who were not at the Cielo Drive residence of Sharon Tate when she and her friends were murdered by the Charles Manson family, or by the Manson family, which is said to have abruptly ended the 60s. And as Russell Ferguson says about this piece, Johnson puts his finger on the inarticulated desire to have been there, to have been touched by this nexus of celebrity and psychopathic violence. He understands the way such incidents have become narratives and also myths. So that place of how there's a sub-story within the famous story of the murders and a kind of like common sort of underlying tone to desire to be there is a subject for Larry. Next slide. So this work, titled Morgan Camera and Untitled, Morgan Camera and King Olan from 1994, has been read by a lot of different writers as about class struggle embodied through business logos. In his essay, again, Russell Ferguson talks about how Larry's dad probably had a King Olan mower, which is probably true and interesting as a kind of point of entry into the work. But I think it points to the fact that there's this kind of perennial exercise of trying to make the artist the subject of their own work. And it's interesting to think of a way in which autobiography can become a vehicle for something much larger. In dialogue with Russell Ferguson, Larry says, "I would deny any autobiographical content. But as Ferguson puts it, the word would kind of leaves a lot of ambiguity in there." So I also really love this quote from a text Gary Indiana wrote. He says, quote, "Using words and images, many of Johnson's work have the effect of social portraiture. If each character in a dream is the dreamer, every figure in a novel a fragment of the novelist's psyche, then all of Johnson's subjects are Johnson. Johnson, in a sense, incarnating other people as an actor incarnates Hamlet or Tartuffe." Next slide, please. So if anything, autobiography allows us to study how references have accumulated in Larry's work and how they can sometimes be traced back and how they've been untethered from their origins. I put this image here as an aside, as a way of pointing to the community of artists within which Larry proverbially grew up in. When Larry was 20 in 1979, Louise Lawler screens her first A Movie Without the Picture at the Aero Theater in Los Angeles, launching a discourse associated with the pictures generation of artists. And, I don't think that Larry's necessarily fits into that category, but I think it's interesting to know that it's something they had to push up against. Next slide. This is an exhibition, 1981, also by Louise Lawler. It was a collaboration between Lawler and Levine, and they collaborated on an exhibition in which essentially the card is the exhibition, and it's really oblique text. There's no indication of what gesture moved them to tears, just his gesture moved us to tears. And again, this consideration of image. And if we're going to think about biography, it's important to note that Larry Johnson actually had the exhibition right before. He was part of a group show right before this exhibition in 1981. Next slide, please. And this is a work by Larry in 2010. And I think the reason I wanted to show these is because I want to talk a little bit about time in Larry Johnson's work. And, you know, he repeats this. There's definitely a reference back to the work that Lawler and Levine were doing with the exhibition, but it's a bit autobiographical because he was there, but it's also about shifting the narrative, perhaps. You know, James Turcotte, the gallerist himself, had a whole life story after that exhibition and at the moment where Larry made this work. For example, he left Los Angeles, came out as gay, wrote books, especially memoirs, and died early of AIDS. And so there's this kind of like potentially new read to the text that's here. And just to unpack it also, it's basically Larry has deconstructed the typography of the text to show how that card would have been made. So there's something about kind of revealing the apparatus behind the making of the original work. In reading this work, Bruce Hanley questions in his Raven Ray catalog, when and how does anything begin to refer? Or he questions that, which I think is an interesting question. What is Larry really pointing to here? Next slide, please. In her essay for the Raven Row catalog, Lisa Lipinski says she doesn't care where Larry's text comes from because the initial experience of the picture is really unaffected by that information. And then she also talks about this work, which is a work called Untitled Ghost Story for Courtney Love, and reads, "You can't smell the roses with amphetamine psychosis." And, you know, in addition to this idea of text sort of disconnected from its source and not needing to know necessarily the point of origin, Lipinski talks a little bit about time in this piece because Larry made it 2 years before Kurt Cobain dies, which arguably becomes the ghost of Courtney Love's life, or how Courtney Love's life is kind of haunted in the public eye after it. And I think questions of time, in addition to questions of location, and time as shuffled through the images that Larry makes, possibly because the references sometimes are old, but they're updated by a new perspective, is a really important way to look into this work or to think about this work. My favorite piece of writing about Larry is titled Gags by writer Gary Indiana and was published in the Belkins Gallery catalog, in which he talks about Larry's dark humor and his relationship to contemporaneity. And I'll read just a little bit of this note. He says, and Gary Indiana is a writer a novelist who often uses real court transcripts or clips to make his, to sort of blend into his texts and make them into fictions. Quote, "A young man who'd recently read one of my books told me that the thing he likes most about it was its contemporaneity, if that's a word. Or as he went on to explain, it's so right now. Though this is what I like best myself in the work of people like Larry Johnson. There's a school of thought in which right now is the same as ephemeral, not for the ages, somehow lacking in historical reach or sticking power. The right now is volatile, chaotic, potentially disruptive of existing hierarchies. In the past, we always survive. The story comes out right. Whereas in the present, we could always just drop dead." Next slide, please. Quickly, before we jump over to the Made in LA work, I wanted to show you 2 more recent techniques of making work that Larry uses, including here rephotographing an illustration, but also using or showing the hand of the artist, a kind of God, you know, the hand of God. Next slide, please. These are stills from Raven Row. Next slide, yeah, thank you. So a kind of promiscuous, no, sorry, I just didn't see you switch over. If you can go back to the draft. So a kind of promiscuous hand of God. Thank you. Okay, now next slide. So I'm not going to talk about the Made in LA pieces. So for Made in LA, and my hope is that I started with all this context so that it's much easier to kind of enter the Made in LA pieces. For Made in LA, Larry made new works. And in some ways, I think they require less decoding based on what we've talked about so far, and especially because you're the audience of right now. We were given the opportunity to do a series of billboards in collaboration with the Billboard Creative, and Larry was really interested in doing signage. And so that was the initial invitation we gave to Larry as part of being in Made in LA. And he made new works for the billboards, 2 of which ended up also in the galleries. Next slide, please. The works in the galleries are the photographs and then the prints of these collages. These were the actual paste ups. They were also shown at Rena Spaulding, which is rare. And I was going to quote Larry in conversation with Russell Ferguson. He says, "I honestly believe my work is different for gay men of my generation than it is for other people, which doesn't mean that other people can't read it, but rather that it's coded really differently depending on the cultural references you hold." Next slide, please. So the left hand, or this work I should say, is titled Untitled L plus R. The left hand is mostly figures of entertainment who had mostly long careers, in contrast to the celebrities that were in the clouds and are arguably gay icons. Their placement is kind of interesting too. The fingers include Barbra Streisand, Sylvia Sidney, Elaine Strick. The lifeline is the author Edward Everett Tanner, who's also known by the pseudonym Patrick Dennis. And the love line is Johnny Guitar, a 1954 American Western drama starring Joan Crawford. Humorously, the wrist is Bob Fosse, famous for being a proponent of the jazz hands. Next slide. I really feel like if you follow Larry's work, there's a lot of pleasure in reading new work, almost like reading a new novel from an author you love. The right hand is porn entertainers, some of which died quite young, including in the fingers Leo Ford, who died in a car crash at 34, Al Parker of AIDS at 40, and in the hand, in the palm, porn media companies, including at the wrist, Sean Cody, which is a gay pornography studio founded in 2001 with a strict model selection which requires contracts of having no prior pornographic experience, so exclusive men. Some of the people that I've walked through the show talk about it as a portrait, a self-portrait of Larry. I think it's also a really interesting way to think about this relationship to time that Larry has in his work, or a kind of prescience, or a kind of foreshadowing of time through the past. And that shuffling of time, I think, has a lot of kinship in the exhibition of Made in LA, because there are other works that kind of do that too, which came to mind while I was preparing for today, including Black News, a project by Khalil Joseph, which similarly kind of proposes that time isn't so linear, and that you can revisit or reshuffle time, aligning different temporalities next to each other, and can be read by a contemporary audience in a different way. Okay, next slide. So these are the billboards. These are the hands in the world, in the city. These appear in the landscape totally unhashtagged, a kind of rip in the fabric of advertising. Next slide, please. Larry picked 5 billboards around MacArthur Park, a neighborhood that has a varied history, including being originally a luxury development, hosting CalArts before it was CalArts, and being the home of the Silver Platter, a queer bar known for its performance night. Recently, it's also been the home of Rena Gaga, a gallery duo, and of Larry's friend Adam Stamp's project, A New Low. Next slide, please. This slide reads, who can ever get enough of Bristol Palin, which is in a text message format that Larry uses, where the first line is bolded as a title, which I originally thought was a mistake, but actually really aligns with some of his untitled and parenthetical structure. As a reminder, Bristol Palin is an American public speaker, memoirist, reality television star, who's the oldest daughter of politician Sarah Palin. Next slide, please. And this slide says, question, for what is the program of the bourgeois party? Answer, a bad poem on springtime, filled to bursting with metaphors. And this is a direct quote from Walter Benjamin's Reflections. Next slide, please. And the final billboard is says notary, and it points directly down to Larry's friend, Adam Stamp's studio and space, Adam, who also works as a notary. And next slide, please. As well as sort of contextualized by being very close to the historical Silver Platter. Next slide, please. I think bars and clubs, really are an important feature of Larry's kind of ecosystem and work process. This is an image of the blacklight in the catalog for Raven Row. And last slide, or final slide, sorry, next slide, yeah. This is an image of the Astro Diner where we met Larry for studio visits, because he doesn't have a studio. Next slide. we really conceived of the Made in LA catalog as another space for the artists. And so we have it structured in two parts for each artist. One is studio pictures. And for Larry, because he doesn't have a studio, he sent our photographer, Katie Shane, to take these stolen images of Astro Diner, because they're not allowed, of food that's being served there and so on. Next slide. And then the final slide, so these are the food. The final couple of slides, next slide, are Larry's actual contributions to the pages of the catalog. And they sort of elucidate some of the works I showed earlier, or at least point back to them. I think sometimes I look at the contribution he made to the catalog as a kind of map of process or a series of internal references to his own work. You have pages from The Misfits, the Arthur Miller play turned film. You have a label from the work I mentioned earlier, the classically tragic story work from when Larry had a survey at the Hammer. You have a page from Gore Vidal's novel Myron, which was a novel published shortly after the anti-pornography ruling by the Supreme Court, in which Vidal responded by replacing the profanities in his novel with the names of the justices that had signed that order. Next slide, please. And a pay stub of Clark Gable, probably used, and a stub of Moviegoer magazine, a very short-lived magazine that Larry used in a work that I didn't have a chance to show here today. Okay, one more slide. So as an addendum, I wanted to just kind of end on the note of Larry himself being the stuff of myths, which is kind of the substance of his work also. He's been the subject of portraits by painters, including Julian Wynne and Jill Mulady, next slide, as well as the model for a character in the Gary Indiana novel Resentment, a comedy. And on the right, a portrait of Larry Johnson by Liz Larner. And that's something that sort of began very early on for him. Next slide. This is him in a work by David Robbins in 1986, where David Robbins was showcasing the emerging artists of the time. And Larry is third from the left in the second row, or the second row, yeah. Okay, that's it. I couldn't get into a lot. There's a lot to talk about in Larry's work, including a redefinition of camp, whatever that means now. But that might have to be for another time. And if you need, or I could point you to some additional text to talk and read about Larry. So I have all of 1 minute to take questions, which I feel terrible about, but I am happy to take questions. And Nick, can we take questions? Oh, Nick has a question here. Okay, maybe I'll take, I'll answer these two questions here. Is Larry Johnson at current exhibition at the Hammer in Westwood? Yes, he is. Those two Palm Street images are on view at the Hammer Museum. And then Nick has a question. How much does Larry desire the viewer to get or understand his references? Also, why the Astro Diner? I think the Astro Diner for a mix of reasons. So here I'm fully just answering for him without knowing. One, I think it's close to his house. He can walk there. And Larry doesn't drive, which makes him an outlier in Los Angeles for his long residency here. And how much does Larry desire the viewer to get or understand? I think it's a great question, because I think the point is that there's a lot of different ways to read his images, and his references and what they refer to. So if you are a gay man of his generation, as he said, there's a whole subtext that you might understand. But if you're a contemporary viewer, you might read them in a really different way. So I think that Larry proposes or doesn't explain his work. So I think he's proposing that there are ways that everybody can read the different pieces, but also there's a kind of specific subset of people, especially his contemporary audience within the moment of making a piece, that will understand it in a different way, and that's valuable too, that things don't always have to be, in a way, eternal, I suppose. Kind of like interpreting here. Are there any other questions I can answer for you guys today? Okay. Thank you, Nick. Okay, so with that note, I will end and thank you again for joining all of the lunchtime art talks on the various artists I've made in LA. It's been a really profound experience working on this exhibition for all of us in all the different teams at the museums. And so we're happy to have been able to give this additional context. Thank you so much. And I think the lunchtime art talks will resume at the end of August with works from the collection by the Hammer curators. So thank you. Have a good day.